I gave them my pension savings to help with the down payment. A month later, I asked to visit the new house. My daughter-in-law met me at the door and said, "This is our future, you represent everything we're trying to escape." My son looked away. I drove back in silence. What she didn't know was that the property was still under a silent lien and when the letter from the bank arrived. "This is our future," she said, and she shut the door in my face like I was a stranger selling something she didn't want. I stood on that porch for a long moment, the smell of fresh paint and cut grass drifting out past the closed door, and I listened to the quiet that followed the click of the latch. My son Evan was somewhere behind that door. I had seen him standing in the hallway when Lion stepped forward to fill the frame, his eyes fixed somewhere on the floor, his hands shoved deep into his pockets like he was trying to disappear into himself. He hadn't said a single word, not one. And I had driven 2 hours to be there. My name is Harold Keene. I am 68 years old, a retired machinist who spent 40 years turning raw steel into something useful, and I have spent most of my life believing that sacrifice and love are the same thing. People who know me well, and there aren't many left, will tell you I am stubborn in ways that go past normal. They'll say I confuse helping with controlling, that I believe if I fund something I own a piece of it, that I hold onto grievances the way other men hold onto photographs. They would not be wrong. I know my flaws better than anyone does. I just don't always choose to fix them. I raised Evan alone after his mother left when he was 9 years old. I worked double shifts, skipped vacations, drove a rusted truck for 11 years so he could have new shoes and field trip money and a college fund I scraped together quarter by quarter. I loved that boy with everything I had, and everything I had came with strings I never thought to mention out loud. The day I emptied my pension early, I told myself it was pure generosity. I told myself I was securing his future, giving him a foundation, making sure he had something solid under his feet. The penalties were brutal. The tax hit was worse. I lost almost a third of what I had saved over 30 years of grinding work just to get the money out in one lump sum. But I wrote the check and I drove it to his apartment and I put it in his hands and I said, "This is for your home, son. Make it count." What I did not say out loud, what I had written into a quiet little agreement that Evan skimmed in about 90 seconds and Lion never read at all, was that the money came with conditions. What I also did not mention was that before they closed on the property, I had arranged for my name to appear in the paperwork in a way that gave me a silent lien on the house. Not a gift, a loan with teeth, a safety net that doubled as a leash. That is the kind of man I am, and I wish I could say I'm ashamed of it, but the truth is I was proud of my own cleverness right up until the moment that door clicked shut and I understood what it had actually cost me. I walked back to my truck slowly. The neighborhood was pretty, young trees planted along the sidewalk, their roots still shallow. A couple of kids riding bikes at the end of the street. The kind of neighborhood you dream about when you're working nights and eating cold sandwiches in a break room. I got in the truck and I sat there for a moment with my hands on the wheel, and I did not cry because I am not built for crying. What I felt instead was something cold settling into my chest, something that made my fingers go tight and my jaw go hard. Resolve, that's the word for it. Cold, quiet resolve. I drove home without looking back at the house. The whole 2 hours I turned the situation over and over in my mind like a piece of metal on a lathe, looking for the angle, looking for the edge. Lion's voice kept replaying in my head. "You represent everything we're trying to escape." I had gone over there to see the house. My money had bought that house, and she had looked at me like I was something she found on the bottom of her shoe. When I got home, my driveway was empty the way it always is, and the house was quiet the way it always is, and I sat down at my kitchen table and I pulled out the folder I had kept since the beginning. The agreement was in there, printed on plain paper, signed only by me but written in language that I had been careful about. The lien documents were in there too, the ones the bank had processed as part of the financing arrangement I had quietly set up with the help of a man named Robert Delaney, a semi-retired title attorney I had known for decades. Robert had warned me. He had sat across from me in his cluttered office and given me the kind of look that lawyers give you when they think you're about to do something you'll regret. "Harold, you understand that if you ever enforce this, it won't just affect the property," Robert had said, sliding the papers toward me with 2 fingers like they were something fragile. "It'll affect the relationship. Permanently." "I'm not planning to enforce it," I told him. "It's insurance." Robert had looked at me over his glasses. "Insurance is something you buy and hope you never use. This feels like a weapon you're hoping to need." I hadn't answered him. I just signed where he pointed and thanked him for his time. Sitting at my kitchen table that night with the folder open in front of me and the house so quiet I could hear the refrigerator hum, I thought about what Robert had said. I thought about Evan's eyes on the floor. I thought about Lion's hand on that doorframe. And I made a decision that I told myself was about justice and that I knew in some honest corner of my mind was about pain. I decided to wait. I would not call. I would not text. I would give them time to come to their senses and reach out to me with some kind of acknowledgement, some recognition of what I had given up to make their life possible. And if they didn't come around in a reasonable time, I would contact Miriam Holt at the bank, and the mechanism I had set in place would begin to move. The waiting was harder than I expected. I am not a patient man. Every morning I sat at that table with my coffee and the folder and I told myself one more week. One more week. My neighbor, a quiet widower named Gerald who walked his arthritic beagle past my house every morning, noticed something was off after the third week. He stopped on the sidewalk and called out to me through the screen door one morning while I was sitting at the table. "You doing all right in there, Harold?" he asked. "Fine," I said. "You've got that look," Gerald said, "like you're planning something." "I'm retired," I said, "I don't plan things." Gerald looked at me for a long moment and then he and his dog moved on down the street. 3 weeks turned into 5. No call, no text, no card in the mail, nothing. I drove past their house on a Sunday afternoon just once just to see. I parked across the street under a tree and I watched for a while. Lion was in the yard laughing at something on her phone, sitting in a new outdoor chair, her feet up on a matching ottoman. Evan came out of the front door carrying 2 glasses of lemonade and he handed her one and she smiled up at him and he smiled back, and it looked like the life I had paid for was going along just fine without me in it. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. "They wanted freedom," I said out loud to nobody. "Let's see what it costs." I drove straight to the nearest pay phone. There aren't many left, but there's one outside a gas station about 4 miles from their neighborhood, and I used it because I didn't want the call traced to my cell. I called Miriam Holt's direct line at the bank. Miriam was 52, a bank officer I had dealt with during the original financing arrangement, efficient and detached in the way of someone who has learned to keep emotion out of paperwork. She picked up on the second ring. "Miriam," I said, "this is Harold Keene. I'd like to discuss the status of the lien on the Keene property." There was a pause, the professional kind. "Mr. Keene, I'd need to pull the file. Can you come in?" "I'll be there tomorrow morning," I said. "Of course," she said, 9 o'clock. I arrived at the bank at 8:55. Miriam's office smelled like hand lotion and old carpet. She sat behind her desk with the file already open, her reading glasses perched on her nose, her expression professionally neutral. "You're asking to initiate enforcement proceedings," she said, "not a question." "I'm asking what it would look like," I said. Miriam looked at me over her glasses. She reminded me of Robert in that moment. The look was the same. "Mr. Keene, enforcement would trigger a formal notice to the current occupants. They would have a period to respond, typically 30 days, after which the bank would have grounds to begin proceedings related to the lien's satisfaction." "Meaning they'd have to pay me back or risk the property," I said. "In simplified terms, yes," she said. I sat there for a moment. The air conditioning hummed. A printer clicked somewhere in the office behind her. I thought about Evan standing in that hallway with his eyes on the floor. I thought about 30 years of pension contributions. I thought about the Sunday afternoon and the lemonade and the smiles. "Initiate it," I said. Miriam looked at me for one more long second, then she reached for her pen. The notice arrived on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because I had positioned myself to know. Robert still had a contact at the title company and I had asked him, with some guilt and more determination than guilt, to let me know when the paperwork hit. He called me that Tuesday morning while I was eating oatmeal. "It landed," Robert said. "Harold, I want to go on record one more time as saying I think this is going to hurt you more than them." "Noted," I said. "You're a stubborn old man," Robert said. "You've told me that before," I said. "I'll tell you again if it ever sinks in," he said, and then he hung up. I imagined Lion opening that envelope. I had met her only a handful of times before the wedding and a handful of times after, and every time she had been pleasant in a surface way, the way people are pleasant when they're performing politeness rather than feeling it. I imagined her perfectly painted nails slicing through the envelope, her eyes scanning the bank insignia, her face doing that thing it did when something didn't go her way, that quick tightening around the mouth and eyes. I was right about almost everything except the speed of it. Evan called me that same evening. I let the phone ring twice before I picked up, not because I was unsure, because I wanted to be steady. I wanted my voice to come out calm and certain, and I needed those 2 rings to make sure it would. "Dad," Evan's voice cracked on the word, and for a moment something in me hurt in a way I hadn't expected. He was still my son. That part never goes away no matter how cold you train yourself to be. "Dad, what is this? What does this mean?" "It means what it says," I said. "There's a lien on our house? Your name is on our house?" His voice was rising, getting that quality it used to get when he was a teenager and something wasn't fair. You never told us that, you said it was a gift. I said it was for your home, I said. I never used the word gift. That's that splitting hairs, Dad, that's. And then Lion's voice cut in, sharper, closer to the phone. She had been there the whole time, probably standing right next to him, maybe with her hand on his arm. Mr. Keene, are you really going to take our home? Is that what this is? I took a breath. No, I said. I am not going to take your home. I am reminding you whose foundation it stands on. Silence, the long kind, then Evan again, quieter now, the teenager gone and something older in his voice. You could have just talked to us, Dad. I felt that one, I felt it more than I wanted to. I tried, I said, at the door. Another silence. That's not fair, Lion said, and her voice had changed too. The sharp edge was still there, but something underneath it sounded less certain. You can't just show up without calling and then use that as some kind of justification for. You called me a reminder of everything you're trying to escape, I said. While I was standing on the porch of a house that my retirement paid for, I think you can understand why calling ahead felt pointless after that. The silence this time was different, heavier. We need to talk, Evan said finally. Yes, I said, we do. We agreed to meet at a cafe the next Saturday. Not their house and not mine. Neutral ground. The place Evan suggested was a corner cafe about halfway between our neighborhoods. A place run by a man named Luis Ortega who kept the tables far enough apart that you could have a private conversation without performing it for the whole room. Luis was a quiet, observant man in his mid-40s who remembered regular customers and left everyone else alone, which was exactly what I needed. I arrived 20 minutes early and chose a table near the window where I could watch the door. I ordered coffee. I put the folder on the table in front of me, but I kept my hand on it and I did not open it. Evan and Lion arrived together, which I had expected. Evan was wearing a jacket that looked new, the kind of thing you put on when you want to feel more solid than you are. Lion was in all black, which struck me as either coincidental or deliberate, and I decided it didn't matter either way. They sat down across from me. Louis appeared, took their orders without comment, and disappeared again. The three of us looked at each other across the table. Thanks for coming, Evan said. I drove 2 hours for the last meeting, I said. I can manage half that for this one. Lion's jaw tightened, but she didn't say anything, not yet. So, Evan said, and then he stopped. He looked down at the table, then back up at me. So what do you want, Dad? What is it that you actually want from us? I had rehearsed this moment many times in the past week. I had played it out in my head in the car, at the kitchen table, lying awake at 3 in the morning with the ceiling fan going and the house too quiet around me. I had planned to be measured. I had planned to be precise. What came out instead had an edge to it that I hadn't intended, or maybe had intended more than I was willing to admit. What do I want? I set my coffee down. I want to not be told I represent everything my son is trying to escape. I want to not drive 2 hours and get a door shut in my face. I want some basic acknowledgement of what I gave up to make your life possible. We never asked you to give up your pension, Lion said. Lion Evan started. No, she said, and she turned to look at him with a directness that I had to respect even as it frustrated me. No, Evan, he is using financial leverage to punish us for setting a boundary, and I'm not going to sit here and let that get reframed as him being the wounded party. Setting a boundary, I said, and I heard the bitterness in my own voice and I knew it was there and I couldn't quite stop it. Is that what you call it? Yes, she said, that's exactly what I call it. I call it humiliation, I said. I call it being treated like a stranger by my own family. Because you don't respect our autonomy as a couple, she said. You give money and then you expect access. You sacrifice and then you expect control. That's not how healthy relationships work. I wanted to say something sharp back and I could feel it rising in my chest, something hot and probably unfair, but Evan spoke first. She's not entirely wrong, Dad. He said it quietly and he looked me in the eye when he said it, which took more courage than he usually showed. You've always been like this. You help and then you keep score. You give and then you hold it over people. I love you and I know you love me, but that pattern has been there my whole life. I sat with that for a moment. Louis brought their drinks. The cafe was warm, the light coming through the window at a low angle, catching the dust motes floating in the air between us. Maybe, I said finally, maybe that's true, but the way that played out at your door was still wrong. Yes, Evan said, it was. I should have spoken up, I know that. I looked at Lion. She was looking back at me steadily. There was no apology in her eyes, but there was something else, maybe recognition, maybe the beginning of something more complicated than contempt. I will release the lien, I said. I opened the folder and pushed a page across the table toward them. This is already drawn up. I had Robert prepare it. I just need to sign it and it's done. Evan looked at the paper, Lion looked at the paper, then they both looked at me. What's the condition? Lion asked. Because she knew there was one, she knew me well enough by then to know there was always a condition. Respect, I said. That's it, that's all. Not money, not access on my terms. Not holidays where I sit at the head of the table and pretend I own the room, just basic respect. I am Evan's father. I made a significant sacrifice to help you build your life. I don't need to be treated like a guest of honor. I need to not be treated like a problem. Lion looked at me for a long time, then she looked at Evan. That's reasonable, Evan said. I can do reasonable, Lion said. The words were careful, measured, not warm but not cold either, something in between. I picked up the pen. My hand was steadier than I felt. I signed the release and I slid it across the table and Evan took it and held it like something fragile. Thank you, he said. You're welcome, I said, and I meant it, and I also knew that something had already shifted in a way that a signed piece of paper could not unshift. We sat there for another 20 minutes. We talked about nothing that mattered, the cafe, the weather, a show Evan had been watching. Louis refilled my coffee without being asked and I nodded at him and he nodded back. The conversation had the texture of something that was trying to be normal and had not quite figured out how yet. When they finally stood to leave, Evan hugged me. It was a real hug, not a performance, and I held on for a second longer than I meant to. I'll call you, he said. Okay, I said. Lion shook my hand, firmly, professionally, like we were concluding a business arrangement, which maybe we were. I watched them walk out of the cafe together, Evan holding the door for her hand brushing his arm as she passed through. They moved together the way people move when they have decided to be a unit, and I was outside that unit, and some part of me understood that clearly for the first time. Not because Lion was cruel and not even entirely because of what happened at the door, but because I had put myself there. I had built a foundation with a trapdoor in it, and then acted surprised when it changed the nature of what stood on top. Louis came by with the check. He set it down on the table without saying anything and started to walk away, and then he stopped and turned back. Family, he asked, nodding toward the door where they had just left. Son and his wife, I said. Louis nodded slowly. Hard thing, he said, letting people go. I didn't let them go, I said. I signed a piece of paper. Louis considered that for a moment. Sometimes that's the same thing, he said, and then he went back to the counter and left me with the check and the empty coffee cup and the folder with the unsigned copy and the pen that I had already used and the window looking out at a parking lot where Evan's car was just pulling away. I sat there for a while after that, long enough that the lunch crowd started coming in. I thought about Robert telling me it would hurt me more than them. I thought about Gerald and his arthritic beagle. I thought about 40 years of machine work, of learning that if you want a piece of metal to hold together under pressure you have to understand its grain, you have to work with the material and not against it. And I thought about how I had spent most of Evan's life working against his grain and calling it love. I had won in the narrow technical sense of winning. The lien was real and the threat was real, and it had brought them to a table and produced a conversation that probably would not have happened otherwise. I had gotten something close to what I said I wanted, Evan's acknowledgement. The beginning of something that might become respect if we both worked at it carefully enough. But Robert was right, the way he always is when I least want him to be. The victory had a hollow center and I could feel it as I drove home, the 2 lanes of highway unspooling in front of me in the late afternoon light, the truck making its familiar sounds, the radio off because I didn't want noise. What I had done was not wrong in the legal sense. The agreement existed and the lien existed and I had every right to what I had. But rights and rightness are not the same thing, and I know that, and the fact that I chose to use what I had when I did, the way that I did, said something about me that I had to sit with. I had punished my son for his wife's words. I had used money as a weapon while telling myself I was using it as a lesson. I had let my pride carry me past the point where repair was easy and into the territory where it would take years of patient effort to rebuild what the whole situation had damaged. Evan did call 2 weeks later. The conversation was careful on both sides, the way conversations are when people are trying to build a new version of something after the old version broke. We talked for almost an hour. He told me things about his life that I hadn't known, things he had kept from me because he expected me to have opinions about them, and I tried very hard to just listen instead of having opinions. He told me Lion had her own complicated history with parents who used money and access as leverage, which explained some of her fierceness in a way I had not considered. I did not apologize for the Lion because I still believed it was within my rights, but I told him I was sorry for letting things get to that point without more direct conversation, and I meant it. She's not going to be your best friend, Dad, Evan said. I need you to be okay with that. I don't need her to be my best friend, I said. I need what I said at the cafe, that's all. I think we can manage that, he said. The unexpected thing, the twist I had not planned for, came about 3 months after the cafe meeting. I got a card in the mail. Plain white envelope, neat handwriting on the outside. No return address until I flipped it over and then I saw Lion's name. Inside was a card, one of those simple ones with no printed message, just blank space inside. She had written in her precise architectural handwriting, "For what it's worth, I understand sacrifice now in a way I didn't before. We're expecting a child in the spring. I thought you should hear it from us first." That was all, no apology, no warmth exactly, but it was a door, not a closed one. A door opened just enough to let a little light through. I sat at my kitchen table with that card in my hands for a long time. I thought about what Lewis had said, hard thing letting people go. And I thought that maybe the real lesson in all of it was not about leverage or lean enforcement or winning or losing. Maybe it was about what kind of foundation you actually want to stand on, not the legal kind, the kind that holds when the weight is real. I put the card in the folder, right on top of all the legal documents, and I closed the folder. And then after a moment I took the folder and I put it in the back of a drawer where I wouldn't have to look at it every morning. And I sat there in the quiet of my kitchen and I thought about spring.